Okay, this is the video review of the topic of totalitarianism. Before we go any further, the idea of totalitarianism is pretty straightforward. The answer is hidden in the word, right? Totalitarianism, the word total is in it. And the reason why is because a totalitarian leader has total control of everything about their society and their people. So this isn't just political control. It doesn't just mean this person makes the laws. It means they control the economy, they control society, how people live, in a really all-encompassing way. One of the best things you can do if you want to get an idea of totalitarianism, I strongly recommend going to my website on this topic under Global 10 and look at the video about totalitarianism in North Korea. If you just watching that video will give you a really good insight into what it's like to live under a totalitarian leader. All right, basically, if you look at the graphic on the right, that kind of is pretty straightforward. These are all of the aspects of totalitarian control. It doesn't necessarily mean the person does all of them, but these are the kinds of things you would see with a totalitarian leader. So if you see all or most of these, you've got yourself a totalitarian leader. Let's stop at the top, at the 12 o'clock position. That's dictatorship and one-party rule. Dictatorship means somebody who's all-powerful, who makes the laws, who does not have to answer to anyone else. That's dictatorship. One-party rule. For example, in China today, China is ruled by the Communist Party. All other political parties are illegal. Okay, you are either a member of the Communist Party or you're out of luck. That's the idea of one-party rule. The United States, for example, we don't have one-party rule. We have Democrats, we have Republicans. Excuse me, we have other political parties as well. The Green Party, the Working Party, all different things. But that's the idea. It's either a dictatorship, which means one person is in charge, makes all the laws, or it's like one political party that controls everything. All right, to the right of that, dynamic leader. This is the idea that generally the person in charge, a totalitarian leader, they kind of set themselves up almost like a celebrity, like, with kind of, they're always making, they'll make speeches and they'll always appear on the media, and they are the face of their country. Okay, going down, the next one is ideology. Ideology, if you look at that word, you can see ideology includes the word idea. Okay, idea, I-D-E-A is actually how you spell idea, but ideology comes from that same idea, from that same word. It means that when this person is in charge, it's not just about political control. It's about this idea, it's about the fact that a totalitarian leader wants the people to buy into an entire belief system, that there are these beliefs, these ideas about how people live, about the culture's role in society. It's not just about you are my leader who makes laws. It's like you buy into it almost like a religion. Again, if you go to the North Korean video that I mentioned earlier, you can see that when you visit North Korea, the president is considered, they have like a dead president who still, they literally worship their former presidents. They think they're like, you have to bow when you see them. They think that their, leader is, he does everything but walk on water. He's like perfect at everything. He's wonderful at everything. When you think of Hitler, right, it wasn't just enough for Hitler to be in charge of the country. They had kids who they wanted to join the Nazi youth and stuff like that. Again, it's this whole, like, you have to buy into a whole belief system. Next, state control over all sectors of society. Again, this is what I was talking about before, that it's not just that they make political rules. They literally want to tell people how to live. For example, in North Korea, men can only get certain haircuts. All right, if you want to look that up, there's like a North Korean haircut, and everybody's haircut is like similar to the leader's haircut and stuff like that. I mean, it's nuts that they want to control everything about you. What job you have, what ideas you have, all of that. State control over the individual, again, similar idea. The control, like I said, the control of people gets down into like the nitty-gritty of how you live, what you think. State control over all sectors of society, like I said, political, economic, social, everything. Propaganda. This is huge for totalitarian leaders. We generally see, if you remember, you should know this word, propaganda. Propaganda basically means a one-sided message. So this can be either TV news broadcasts, posters, radio, movies, whatever it is. It shows a very biased, which you should remember that discussion of that term from the beginning of the year, but a very biased, a very one-sided message. And it's all designed to prop up, to make the totalitarian leader look more powerful, more exciting, more, the country more wonderful, and really stir up the people. Then last one is use of force. Generally speaking, when you have a totalitarian leader, you generally have a secret police force. Anyone who defies the leader or goes against the government ends up winding up dead or in prison, and without a trial, without a fair trial or anything like that. So those are pretty common. All right, when we talk about totalitarianism, especially during this World War II era, we're usually talking about either fascism or communism. And like stupid people always make it sound like fascism and communism are the same thing. If you hear somebody saying that they're the same, the person doesn't know their history that well. Fascism and communism are two different things. You cannot be a fascist and a communist. They're actually very different. Fascism is what Italy and Germany had. Fascism is really known for what they call ultra-nationalism. Like, remember in Nazi Germany, right? They took nationalism to crazy town, right? It wasn't just Germany's great. It was Germany is the master race. We are the master race. We are the best people. Our country, needs to rule everyone else. We have the best society. And it's this like laser focus. It's this complete focus on your own country, your own people. And fascism also has no problem with like a capitalist kind of system where there's rich people and middle class people and poor people. They have no problem with that. Fascism has class. It is a class system. Communism, on the other hand, is different. If you remember, the whole idea of communism comes from that theory of Marx and Engels. This idea that society is broken up between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And basically, a true communist country wants communism to spread. Like, almost like a religion, you know what I'm saying? They're always looking to convert people. And so communism isn't about, for example, in Russia, it's not enough for like Russia to turn communist and become the USSR. It's not enough. It's not because, the greatness of the Russian people. This idea, it is proletariat everywhere. Proletariats across the world should be overthrowing the bourgeoisie. Communists support proletariat uprisings all over the world. Very different than fascism. Fascism was, focused on one country being successful and being better than everybody else. Communism is about all workers all over the world overthrowing the bourgeoisie, overthrowing the capitalist system. And it goes past borders. Also, with communism, all bourgeoisie are bad. When I say all bourgeoisie, I mean including Russian. Russian bourgeoisie are the bad guys. You need to eliminate bourgeoisie, these counter-revolutionary forces inside your own country. All right. In addition, again, communism is all about the ideal of communism is a classless society where everyone is a worker, everyone is a comrade. Naturally, it doesn't work out that way. If you go to communism, if you are a member of the party, you are generally much better off. You're much more wealthy if you're a high-ranking figure in the Communist Party versus if you're, a regular old worker and stuff. So there are, don't get me wrong, there are classes and things like that. But, like, in theory, it's supposed to be a classless society, in theory. In practice, it generally isn't, but. All right, so that's the idea. If you see any kind of reference to any of these features, just know that they're talking about this idea of totalitarianism. The most important, actually the one that gets asked about the most on the Regents as far as totalitarianism is communist Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. If you remember from the earlier presentation on the Russian Revolution, you're going to remember that the Bolshevik Party, under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, overthrew the provisional government during the Bolshevik Revolution, the October Revolution of 1917, and introduced and created the first communist country in the entire world. Okay, so this is a country that's going to be run on the principles invented by Marx and Engels. But if you remember from our discussion during the Industrial Revolution, the Communist Manifesto that Marx and Engels wrote was a very short, like, pamphlet. It wasn't that long. It wasn't very detailed. It just was a theory. And it was up to people like Lenin and Stalin to actually create an economy based on these principles, okay? So Joseph Stalin actually he changes the economy of the Soviet Union. If you remember, Lenin introduced the NEP, New Economic Policy, had a little bit of, still had some capitalism in it, things like that. Stalin goes a whole different way, and really Stalin creates this kind of template, this model for how a communist economy should be run, and it is very influential. So communist countries that come after him basically run their country very similarly. So what do I mean by that? He introduces 5-year plans. And the idea of a 5-year plan is, again, if you remember from the theory of communism, it believes in public ownership, that all private property should be shared. So the way Joseph Stalin interprets this is all businesses are owned and run by the government. Okay? All businesses are run and owned by the government. So the government makes all the economic decisions. Now, if you remember from capitalism is the system that the United States has, that this country has. If you run a business, whether it's a pizza parlor or a steel mill, it is up to the individual business owner to decide what to make, who to buy, what wages to pay, what prices. Well, they set the prices based on supply and demand and all that. It's all handled individually by the business owner, looking at the market and things like that. In a communist country, it's very different. All business decisions are made by the government. And the government sets prices however they want. Does not have anything to do with supply and demand, just whatever they think the price should be set at. So the way the government runs the economy is the government makes what they call a series of 5-year plans. And so in that 5-year plan, they'll make the decisions of what industries they're going to invest in, what level of production they're going to set, and things like that. Okay, those are, in 5 years, it is their kind of vision of where the economy is going to go for the next 5 years. For Joseph Stalin, his 5-year plan was built around the idea that he had to improve the Soviet economy. It had started getting a little better under Lenin, but it was still very far behind the West. And Joseph Stalin wanted the Soviet Union to catch up very quickly. And if you look at generally in an economy, especially during this World War II era, today it's a little different, but back in World War II, the two main drivers, the two parts of your economy where a country makes most of its money is, number one, in agriculture, and the second one is through manufacturing, through business, through industry, all right? So it's either through industry, your businesses, or your agriculture, through your farming. So his 5-year plan looked at these two aspects of his economy. And the 5-year plan looked at what the plans were for industry, what the plans were for agriculture. So just really briefly, as far as industry went, he was focused on heavy industry. What do I mean by that? This is like the manufacture of steel, manufacture of more weapons, increasing fuel production and things like that. It ended up being pretty successful. The biggest problem is that because all of the resources of the country were dedicated towards heavy industry, consumer products were really hard to find. I mean, like a sneaker, a toilet bowl, toilet paper. I mean, you waited on lines like crazy. There were shortages like you wouldn't believe. But generally speaking, it did push the economy forward. The other part of the 5-year plan focused on agriculture, and that was really problematic. That caused a lot of problems. What he said was he wanted to make farming more efficient. Now, if you remember from the Industrial Revolution, from our discussion of Britain, from our discussion of the agricultural revolution that Britain went through, the way it was able to make its farms more productive, right, was through the law, the enclosure law, which ended up getting fewer larger farms. Remember that? Individual farmers who had small plots of land, a lot of them ended up going out of business, and they ended up selling off to the larger landowners. So we had a lot of large farms. And these large farms ended up becoming much more efficient because they had mechanization. They started using machines to grow crops. In addition, they used there were new ways to grow crops. Remember, they changed to crop rotation and things like that. Long story short, that kind of evolved in England, and that's how England had its agricultural revolution. Joseph Stalin wants to create a similar thing in his own country. He wants farms that are much more productive, much more efficient, and much more mechanized, all right? And to be able to do this, he says, all right, all of these tiny individual farms are not efficient. Okay, the word efficient means when you're efficient means you run something really well, like you do a lot with very little. Does that make sense? When you're efficient, you're able to accomplish a lot with very little resources, very little whatever. And he says these farms are the opposite of that. They're inefficient. So there's a lot of money, a lot of work is being put into these farms, and they're producing very little, not enough food. They're not producing enough food. So he says, I want to make these farms more efficient. And so he says, instead of having all these tiny farms, I want big farms that will use, the latest technologies and the latest techniques to produce much more food. And now this may sound like a good idea, but of course the people who hate this idea are the individual farm owners, right? These little farmers are like, I love my farm. I'm happy to own my farm. I don't want to give up my farm. I don't want the government to take my farm away from me and turn me from an owner to an employee, basically, in my own farm. And they hate this. And what makes it even worse is that most of the farmland for Russia is located in the Ukraine. Now what happens is remember, the Soviet Union is a union of many different ethnic groups, many different nationalities. So the Soviet Union, its capital is in Moscow, and Moscow is located in the Republic of Russia. And so Russia is filled with Russians, okay? That's one ethnic group. The Ukraine, however, is not filled with Russians. It's filled with Ukrainians. Okay, so it's a different ethnic group. So the Ukrainians don't necessarily love Russia and love the Soviet Union. You get what I'm saying? So there's that kind of animosity makes a bad situation worse. What happens is the people of the Ukraine rebel against this idea of collective farms, because that's what Stalin's plan was. Stalin's plan was called collective farming. He was going to collect up all these little farms and make big farms. He was going to collect them all up and make big farms instead of lots of little farms. That's collective farming. But these little farm owners hated this idea. They're known as Ukrainians. The biggest landowners, Ukrainian landowners, were known as kulaks. You may see that word, if you could throw that into an essay, you'll make 1,000,000 points. But the kulaks and things like that. And so they rebelled. They did not want to do this. And Joseph Stalin basically turns around and is like, listen, you don't want to collectivize? Then you are going to starve. And that's what he did. He purposefully starved the Ukrainians on purpose. He forced them. He said, if you are not going to collectivize, I'm going to take all the food and let you all starve. And it was terrible. People were dropping dead in the streets. You can see the picture right here. This is another genocide. It is, they call it the Holodomor. I can't pronounce it. Holodomor. That's the name for this genocide of the Ukrainian people. And basically 6 to 7 million people, men, women, very young children, all die. And he does this until he forces the people of the Ukraine to collectivize. So they either are starved to death, some people are shot and arrested, other people are sent to the prisons out in Siberia. Okay, it's called the Gulag, by the way. Gulag is the Russian prisons. And basically, through use of terror, by use of force, he forces everybody to collectivize. All right, so the next thing you need to know about Joseph Stalin, if that wasn't enough to tell you what a winner this guy is, he actually kills even more people. And the way he's going to kill these people is in something known as the Great Purge. The idea is basically Joseph Stalin, when he takes power, he's terrified that his enemies are out to get him. You don't need to know this for the regents, but just FYI, remember I told you Lenin was the person who introduced communism to the Soviet Union, right? What happens is when Lenin dies, Stalin takes over. Lenin did not want Stalin to take over. He didn't get along with him. He didn't like him. And he actually wanted another guy to take over. Lenin wanted Trotsky to take over. Trotsky was actually the guy who led the Red Army. Anyway, but long story short, through political maneuvering, Stalin ends up taking power. Trotsky runs. He gets out of the Soviet Union as fast as he can, and he hides out in Mexico because he knows Stalin's crazy. He'll come kill him. And he's right. So, but Stalin basically goes through this purge where he is positive that the Politburo, that's the organization, that's the political party that's the communist political party in the Soviet Union. He's positive that inside the Politburo there are enemies. Stalin's enemies are there, and these guys, he calls them Trotskyites. These are followers of Trotsky, and he needs to find them and get rid of them because they're his enemies. Long story short, he goes nuts. Like, it gets to the point where he sees enemies everywhere. Everybody's his enemy. Even his friends. He turns on his friends and gets rid of them. You'll see things where, he'll take group photos and then he'll have the photos doctored to remove people who were found to be enemies of the state, and he gets rid of them. He had these show trials where he would put people on trial, but literally 100% of the people who went on trial were found guilty. There wasn't a real trial. It was just for show. If you were put on trial, you were going to be found guilty. And it was terrible. As you can see, they're not even sure of the exact numbers. 700,000 to about 1 million people may have been killed in the purge. It was like, you'd have like trials where like the father would be considered an enemy of the state, and the child, the son, like a young son, would be killed in his place and stuff. It was nuts. The purge ends, and by the way, if you're thinking, wow, this sounds familiar, it should. It should sound really familiar to that other, homicidal nutcase from the French Revolution, Robespierre. Okay, if you remember, Robespierre went through a reign of terror where they were getting rid of their enemies. You could definitely compare the reign of terror to the Great Purge. All right, so whereas the reign of terror ends when Robespierre is killed, the Great Purge ends when Trotsky is killed. Joseph Stalin's spies finally find him in Mexico. They execute him, and once they execute him, the Great Purge kind of ends. All right, so with that, obviously, if you couldn't tell already, Joseph Stalin is what we call a totalitarian leader. There is a single party, the Communist Party. He has a secret police. He uses lots of propaganda. I mean, check out that picture. Like with Stalin holding a baby. Like you want Stalin to be your babysitter. What are you, out of your mind? He uses censorship. There's no free media. He controls what's being said in the media. He controls all aspects of Soviet people's lives. He controls all aspects of the economy, the political system, the society, everything. All right. The other totalitarian leader we need to talk about is Adolf Hitler. I'm sure you know a lot about him, so hopefully I'll be able to go through this pretty quick. First, you need to know that the Nazi Party takes over after the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic is a democratic government. It's a republic, and it is the Weimar Republic is the one that signs the Treaty of Versailles. If you remember, I told you the Treaty of Versailles is the treaty that ends World War I. And if you remember, I told you The treaty is so bad. The treaty to end World War I is so bad, it is a cause for World War II. So you can see how the people blamed the government. They blamed the Weimar Republic for signing the Treaty of Versailles. There was a lot of economic problems inside Germany, which allowed Hitler to come to power. We're going to talk about that more when we look at the causes of World War II. All right? But anyway, like I said, the Nazi Party is going to take over after the Weimar Republic. Adolf Hitler is a fascist. Okay, remember, he's a fascist. That means he believes in extreme nationalism, all right? And I'm sure you guys know, he believes in this, what he calls the Third Reich, which is long story short, it's like this third great government of Germany. He thinks Aryans, which are like white Germans, are the master race, and all of Germany's problems are caused by Jews, communists, the French, and all these other people that need to be wiped out. Again, a totalitarian leader. Remember, we talked about all of those qualities. He has an ideology. This is a full belief system about Nazism and about the role of Germans. He uses a lot of propaganda. There's only one party, the Nazi Party, that's allowed to exist. He uses secret police, censorship, and naturally he is, of course, the person behind the Holocaust, where he's going to kill off the Jews of Europe as well as other groups. We will go into the Holocaust in more detail later. All right, just as an FYI, there are other totalitarian leaders during this era. They usually don't come up as much, so I'm going to go over them briefly. The first is Benito Mussolini. You should definitely know that name. He comes up a bit. Again, he's a fascist. He is from Italy. His army is known as the Black Shirts, which should sound familiar because if you remember from our nationalism lesson, if you remember, there was Garibaldi, who was the sword of the revolution. His army is known as the Red Army, named after the color of his shirts. Benito Mussolini's army, however, is known as the Black Shirts. All right, and he's the person who's responsible for invading Ethiopia. Japan, that leader is Hideki Tojo. Some people consider him a totalitarian leader, some people don't. It's a little tricky because of the fact that you really don't have a dictatorship per se, and you don't really have one-party rule. What happens is that Tojo actually shares power with the Emperor of Japan. So they both work together, so he doesn't really have complete control. So that's one thing. They do consider him like a military dictator, probably more than just a totalitarian leader. But certainly there are certain aspects. They preach this kind of ideology of Japan being this great culture. They worship the emperor as a god. There's a big focus on, like it says right there, anti-Western feelings, that this idea of great nationalism. Shintoism, remember, that's the nature religion that is practiced in Japan. There's a big focus on that. And then finally, last one is Francisco Franco. He is the leader of Spain. I haven't seen this come up in previous years. However, now that we have the new Regents where it only focuses on 10th grade content, I wouldn't be surprised to see a question on the Spanish Civil War. Long story short, Spanish Civil War comes up. As it says right here, it's considered a dress rehearsal for World War II because a lot of the same players who jumped in and got involved in World War II also got involved in the Spanish Civil War. But however, Spain stays neutral during World War II. They do not get involved. So even though Franco is a totalitarian leader, he's a fascist, he does not get involved. And you can see right there that he uses his secret police, he uses terror to control the people of Spain. So if you hear any reference to the Spanish Civil War, Francisco Franco, that's where he comes in. All right, with that, we're done with this video. Please come back to watch the next video on the causes of World War II.